Alright, what we're going to look at is the idea of seeing Jesus in the Old Testament. Now, I have to confess that that is a bad title. It's kind of a tricky title. The reason I gave it the title of Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament is because I wasn't sure if I wanted to say Seeing Jesus through the Old Testament, Knowing Jesus in the Old Testament. One, I didn't want to rip off Christopher Wright, which is a great book that you're going to want to get, which is called Knowing Jesus Through the Old Testament. So if you're interested in this, he does a great job. So what I'm going to be going through today, you'll find a lot of it in here. There's a lot of other good authors that have talked about this topic. But Wright is a great starting resource. So the reason that this is not necessarily the best title is because when you say Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament, you might get the impression what we're going to do is we're going to kind of flip our way through the Old Testament, and with every page we're going to go, oh, well, I can see Jesus here, and this passage is really about Jesus. You know, you find Jesus on every page of the Old Testament. Well, not necessarily. So what you find with the New Testament authors is there's kind of a two-way conversation that happens. That the Old Testament certainly tells us about Jesus. When we read Jesus, and we understand Jesus in light of the Old Testament. Okay, that's how the apostles, one of the reasons the apostles could argue for Jesus as being Israel's Messiah, is they went back to the Old Testament and they said, okay, see, we can see Jesus in these passages. Obviously, the ultimate demonstration was his resurrection. That's what finally, certainly made valid Jesus' claim. But what you're going to see when you read the New Testament is, because of who Jesus is, and because of the way this all turned out, his death, resurrection, and ministry, the way everything changed, is the apostles then go back and reread the Old Testament in the light of Jesus. So, seeing Jesus in the Old Testament, well, it is that. You can go back and find Old Testament passages and we will see Jesus in there. However, it's a two-way conversation, and a lot of times the apostles will read the Old Testament, and so we actually understand the Old Testament from, say, a Christological perspective. We understand the Old Testament in its correct understanding because of who Jesus is. Okay, so that's why Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament is not necessarily the best title. But the Old Testament is absolutely necessary for us to truly understand Jesus. That's why I was so happy when Lachlan did that icebreaker. And most everybody, when he said Old Testament or New Testament people, most everybody went to the Old Testament. That just so blessed me, because I'm an Old Testament guy. And the reason that I am is because if you think about the summary statement of the gospel, John 3:16, and that's just a great one verse that summarizes the gospel. That verse is unintelligible. You actually cannot understand that verse if you don't understand the Old Testament. Here's what I mean. You're explaining the gospel to somebody and you say, you know what? For God so loved the world. They go, wait a minute. Which God are you talking about? Oh, you got to go all the way back to the beginning. The Creator God, the one true God, the God who created heaven and earth by His Word. Oh, okay. In the beginning, so, for God so loved the world. Well, wait a minute. Who's the world and why does He love it? Oh, well, the world is a universe, a cosmos full of people who created in His image, who rebelled against Him. But He loves them because they are His creation and they're created in His image. So for God so loved the world, and this is the part I love the best, that He gave His only Son, and because He gave His Son, whoever believes in Him won't perish but have everlasting life or eternal life. So God gave the Son. Well, what does that mean? You realize in that one verb, John has summarized the entire Levitical system. What does it mean that God gave the Son? Well, He gave Him to be the sacrifice. He's not only the Passover lamb, He's the burnt offering, He's the guilt offering, He's the sin offering. You have to understand tabernacles and temples and priesthood and sacrifices and clean and unclean laws. In one verb, John sums up all of Exodus 20 through Deuteronomy. He gave His Son. Now, even that we would think, Well, that's the distinctly New Testament part. The Son, that's the part that's uniquely New Testament. Well, not exactly. We're going to see in the Psalms, especially Psalm 2, that God had a Son back then. The Son of God actually meant something in Old Testament Messianic theology. For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whoever believes in Him would not perish. Well, wait a minute. Who's perishing and why? What does it mean that we're perishing? Why are we perishing? Oh, because the Creator God, the one that I'm talking about at the beginning of the verse, He actually created this beautiful world. He created humanity in His image, and we rebelled against Him, and therefore He exiled us from the garden, and we're deserving of His wrath. Okay, so you rebelled, is what you're saying. Yes, we rebelled. So God so loved the world that He gave His Son, that whosoever believes in Him would not perish, but have everlasting life. Okay, well, what's everlasting life? Well, it's what God did in the garden. The prophets have been pointing towards and saying there's going to be a restoration, a renewal, and this glorious consummation that's going to redo beyond anything we could have ever understood from the garden. And He calls it eternal life. Eternal life is a fixing of what happened originally. So John 3:16, unless you understand the Old Testament, we can't really understand that. So that's why classes like this, or Old Testaments, I love them. And so what we're going to look at today is kind of a really brief overview of the story of the Old Testament and how it's beginning to tell us the story of Jesus, so that when we finally get to the kingdom of God, we go, oh, okay, Jesus makes a whole lot of sense. This is easy. The kingdom really shouldn't be that big a surprise. Because what we've done is we've looked at the Old Testament for what it says and how it points forward, but we've seen it in light of who Jesus is and how the apostles kind of redefine things. And you see this two-way conversation. That's where we're headed today. And I'll try to do it in 2 hours. Okay, so first question. What is the story of the Old Testament? And that's kind of an important question to answer, because we're kind of hanging everything off this. And the story of the Old Testament is the story of God breaking into human history in order to establish His kingdom. That really is the story of the Old Testament. And why would we say that? Well, because in Genesis 3, the problem is humanity rebelled. We do need to be saved. We do need to be redeemed. But redemption is a subset. Redemption is sort of a subplot. God will redeem and He will save, but He'll do that because He has reestablished His rule. So what you see in the Old Testament is God is working. He's breaking into human history in an attempt to establish His kingdom. One of the roles, we could say, or the way we see God throughout the Old Testament, is that of a king. You know, you think about the Psalms. Open up these gates, and who are we letting in? The King of Glory. In Genesis chapter 1, we tend to look at Genesis chapter 1 as the sort of the scientific how of how God created. Well, God spoke and there was nothing, and God created ex nihilo because He spoke and then suddenly things came into being. Okay, fine, yeah, fair enough. But really, what is the picture of Genesis 1? The picture of Genesis 1 is God speaking and things being created. That's a picture of the Lord Almighty, the King of the universe, on His throne and creating by divine fiat, or by divine command. The role, if we could say this, of God in Genesis 1 as creator is that of king who's creating by divine command. Here's an example of it. We say that Nebuchadnezzar built the Hanging Gardens. Well, I doubt that Nebuchadnezzar ever picked up a shovel, that he ever moved a stone, that man probably never left his palace. But Nebuchadnezzar built the Hanging Gardens. How? He sat on his throne and he said, I want a Hanging Garden. Let there be a Hanging Gardens, and a whole bunch of minions made that happen. Because that's how kings do things in the ancient Near East. So the picture of God in Genesis chapter 1 is not Father, it's not potter, it's not artist. He's an artist. Interestingly, he's an artist and a builder in chapter 2. He forms humanity like a potter would form clay. He uses clay. He builds Eden. So he is a builder, he is an artist, but in Genesis chapter 1, he is the king, the cosmic king, who sits on his throne and defeats the mythical chaos beasts. He tames the waters, he tames the primordial chaos, and he speaks things into existence. And so for the rest of the story, it's about how the king is breaking into human history to reestablish his rule. That's what everything is going to hang. Okay, so if that's the case, let's kind of walk our way through the Old Testament story. Okay, well, the problem we know from Genesis chapter 3 is that humanity has rebelled. Something's got to be done. At the bottom, I also have, we're going to trace some promises throughout the Old Testament, which I think you'll find very interesting. And there's some summaries. That there's about 5 or 6 defining events in the Old Testament, defining people and defining events that we go back and we point to and we say, this is how we know that it's this story. And these things are summed up in red and black. All right, so the problem is humanity has rebelled against God. And of course, they have to be exiled from the garden. They can no longer be in his presence. So what's God going to do about it? He comes up with this brilliant plan. And when I say he comes up with, you realize that, you understand that I mean that these are figures of speech. God obviously knows all things from the beginning. I'm not saying sort of this is a fly by the seat of your pants plan. But God comes up with a brilliant plan. He says, I'm going to go find a 75-year-old pagan, and I'm going to call him. And through this 75-year-old pagan idolater, I'm going to unfold and fulfill this plan that at the end, I rule and reign over all the new creation, and I have my people gathered to me in redemption and salvation. And you go, wow, can't wait to see how this one's going to work. All right, Genesis chapter 12. Let's look at the promises that God made to Abraham. Have someone read Genesis 12, 1 to 3. We all know this, but we'll read it.
Now the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Okay, thank you. All right, so there's basically 3 elements to this promise that he makes with Abraham. Seed, or descendants. Could be singular, could be plural. So when you read descendants in this passage, it's actually the word seed, which is kind of this singular collective. He promises them seed, land, and blessing. Okay, now why is blessing so important? Okay, we've got to rewind a little bit and go back to Genesis 1. What's the original intention in Genesis chapter 1? Can I have someone read Genesis 1, 27 and 28? Okay, so we're supposed to be in the image of God. We are in the image of God. And what does that mean in Genesis 1? Well, it means that we're to function as his representative and actually rule creation for him. We're to steward it, we're to rule it for him. But notice in Genesis 1:28, what he wanted to do was bless. He creates this beautiful heavens and the earth. He takes it from formless and void to this beautiful, lush, fit for humanity so that we can live there and he can bless us. That's all he wants to do. We didn't want that. We didn't want the blessing of, the creation, we didn't want the blessing of the garden, so we rebel. But you know what? God is going to bless. That's the intention. He is not going to let that one die, whether we want it or not. He wants to break into human history, establish His kingdom, so that He can bless. That's the original intention. He wants to bless you whether you want it or not. Okay? Alright, so with Genesis 3:16, the first promise that we see is that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. But you'll notice in Genesis 3:15, skip ahead to that one, that the woman has a seed, and notice that the serpent has seed. The conflict is going to be between the he, who is going to be the seed of the woman. But the serpent also has seed. The serpent also has descendants. And so from this point on, you've got sort of a subplot throughout the story, is that there's going to be the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And so who are the seed of the serpent throughout the story? But it makes a difference then, because when you get to John chapter 8, and you've got Jews that don't believe in Jesus. Well, they believe in Him, but they say, we have Abraham as our father. And what does Jesus say? Abraham's not your father. You are sons of your father, the devil. And you do what your father always does, because you're trying to kill me. And the devil was a liar from the beginning. And Jesus calls them sons of the devil. Well, where did He get that? He just make it up? No. Way back in the garden, the devil has seed, he has descendants, and the woman is going to have descendants. So part of the story is, how do the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent play out? Who's in what group, and how do you know? But the promise is the seed, which is going to be a he. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Okay, so that's the first promise in how God's going to establish His kingdom, is He promises that the seed of the woman will come and undo what the serpent did. Alright, so let's go back to this promise that God made to Abraham. So God has made promises to Abraham. And you can sum it up with seed, land, and blessing. But look at chapter 17. In Genesis chapter 17, verse 6, this time God, in chapter 17 of Genesis, the promises are going to become legally binding. They're going to become covenant. But notice one of the things that God says to Abraham. Verse 6, I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. Abraham is going to have kings in his lineage. Why is that important that Abraham has kings in his lineage? Well, because God's trying to break into human history to establish His kingdom. So from the very beginning, He says, okay, 75-year-old pagan idolater, you're going to be the one to help me establish my rule on earth. And so I'm going to give you kings that come from your lineage. So this idea in Samuel's, or we're teaching Judges, or we're teaching 1 Samuel, and this idea that Israel was never supposed to have a king, not true. Israel was always supposed to have a king. The question was, what kind of king? That really was going to be the question. Israel was always supposed to get a king, because God told Abraham that kings were going to come from him. Okay, so Abraham, we've got the promises to Abraham. It's going to include kings. And in summary, the story of Abraham is a story of sovereign election. God has a plan to fulfill. He wants to bring a kingdom, and He just picks Abraham. A 75-year-old idolater from Ur of the Chaldeans. Okay? The next big event. And I got a couple of markers here for Exodus, the Exodus, the conquest. The Exodus is extremely important in this plan. Because the Exodus is the model. It's the paradigm. It's how we know what salvation looks like. Exodus is Israel's salvation event. In the Old Testament, at least pre-exile, Nobody is working to get saved. Nobody is trying to keep the law to merit anything before God and earn salvation. That's a post-exile first century issue. Exodus is their salvation event. God saved them first before He gave them the law. And if you look at Exodus chapter 6, verse 6 and 7, here's the key verse of Exodus. Here's the whole point of God doing what He's doing. Exodus 6, verses 6 and 7. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you for my people, and I will be your God. Okay, you think back to the early church, we said this morning, why the early church looked back on the atonement and said, oh, it's about redemption, it's about ransom, it's about redeeming. We'll get to the justice part, but salvation is about buying people back. Well, you get that from Exodus. Now this verse, or this idea that I will be your God and you will be my people, that's going to appear 120 times. The idea that I delivered you out of the bondage of the Egyptians so that you could be my people and I will be your God. That idea is going to be repeated more than 120 times throughout the rest of the Old Testament. It becomes the paradigm for salvation. So when God starts talking about, you will be my people and I will be your God, immediately we think Exodus. Okay, here's an example of this. Go with me to, we're going to look at Jeremiah 31 a little bit later as well, but go to Jeremiah 31. This is just one example. Okay, you know the book of Jeremiah. It's all about judgment. And when it comes to interpretation, we get our 586, 587 rubber stamp. What does this passage mean? Well, 586. What does this passage mean? Well, the Babylonians. What does this passage mean? 586, 586. Until you get to chapters 31 through 34. Well, sorry, 30 through 33. It's Jeremiah's book of consolation. It's his book of what the restoration looks like. In Jeremiah chapter 30, look at verse 22. When God finally restores them, what's going to be one of the results? Let's have someone read verse 22.
You shall be my people, and I will be your God.
Exodus. So this great restoration, the return from Babylon, is going to be like Exodus. And this phrase, this expression shows up in all four chapters. Look at chapter 31. Chapter 31, verse 1. At that time, says the Lord, I will be the God of all the families of Israel, and they shall be my people. Chapter 31, verse 31 and following, even when the new covenant comes. Look at verse 33. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law within them. I will write it upon their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. The new covenant is a new Exodus. Chapter 32, verse 38. They shall be my people, and I will be their God. So that becomes the key word. That's prophet code language for when God restores us, it's going to be just like Exodus. That's how you know what this is going to look like. If you knew what Exodus meant, and if you know what the Exodus means, then you'll have an idea of what the kingdom looks like when God reestablishes it. It will be a salvation event. All right, Exodus chapter 14. Now it's kind of cool the way God does this. In Exodus chapter 14, why, when God redeems them out of Israel, out of Egypt, when He takes them out of slavery, and He rescues them, why does He take them through the Red Sea? Now, you know the map. There are several ways out of Egypt, right? God takes them through the Red Sea. Why? Well, it's a good way to drown the Egyptian army. It's a good way to deal with an army that's pursuing you. But maybe there's a theological parallel here. Exodus chapter 14. Verse 15. The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it, that the people of Israel may go on dry ground through the sea." Moses is to lift up his staff. God's going to bring a wind over the waters that will separate the waters so that dry land can appear. Does that sound familiar? Creation. Look at verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove back the sea by a strong east wind all night, made the sea dry land. The waters were divided, and the people of Israel went in the midst of the sea on dry ground. That's creation language. So Israel's salvation event is a creation event. Creation and salvation always go together. And in fact, the way that creation is described in Genesis chapter 1, even that creation is a salvation event. God rescued the chaos, brought order out of chaos, and made it habitable. So creation is salvation is creation. It's why when you get to the New Testament, when salvation finally comes, what's Paul's favorite metaphor? It's new creation. Because creation and salvation always go together. So Israel's salvation event is actually their creation event. Okay. Why does, after the first generation rejects and they end up dying in the wilderness, why does God bring them around Edom and have them cross the Jordan? So that the second generation can have a creation event. And it's the same thing happens. The priests step into the water, and the same language is used. The waters parted, the waters were stacked up at Adam in another place, and Israel goes over on dry land. Because salvation is creation. All right, Exodus chapter 15. We kind of looked at this already earlier today. The Lord is my salvation, and it talks in terms of redemption and rescue and ransom. So the Exodus is their salvation event. It's their creation event. This is why when you get to, Paul has to find new metaphors like we talked about this morning. Because the Old Testament, the box, the grid, just can't hold all of the New Testament truth. For Paul to talk about adoption, being adopted as New Testament Christians into God's family, that's not Old Testament. Israel became God's people through creation. So adoption, he's got to come up with something new. Side one. Okay, so Exodus 25 through 40. What happens in Exodus 25 through 40? Well, it is law. Tabernacle. In chapters 25 through 31, all the instructions for the tabernacle. Chapter 35 through 40, they actually build the tabernacle. What happens to the plate? Golden calf. All right, well, let's look at Exodus chapter 25. Exodus chapter 25, this is the beginning of the commandments about all the things that the tabernacle is supposed to include. And verse 1 of chapter 25 says, "And the Lord said to Moses." Now, out of all the instructions in 6 chapters about what to do and how to build the tabernacle, this expression, "And the Lord said to Moses," occurs, guess how many times? How many times do you think that expression, "and the Lord said to Moses"? Come on, you're good Old Testament people. 7. So in the building of the tabernacle, 7 times you have an expression that says, "and God said." Now, what other event do we know of that has God speaking 7 times? Creation. Go with me to chapter 31. This is the 6th the Lord said to Moses. Can I have someone read Exodus chapter 31, verses 1, 2, and 3?
The Lord said to Moses, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with ability and intelligence, with knowledge and all craftsmanship."
Okay, what do you have? On the 6th, and the Lord said. You have a Spirit-empowered human being who is to carry out the work of God. Does that sound familiar? Creation, the 6th day of creation. When God creates humanity, He breathes His Spirit into us, and we become His servants. We tend the garden. Look at the 7th, and the Lord said. Very next chapter, very next paragraph. Starting in verse 12. Could I have someone read verses 12 and 13? Yeah, go ahead and read it.
The Lord said to Moses, "Say to the people of Israel, you should keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you through your generations. That you may know it, that I, the Lord, sanctify you."
Okay, thank you. Notice the 7th, and God said. 7. What was the 7th day of creation? Sabbath. Okay, so what is the tabernacle supposed to be? How is the tabernacle supposed to function theologically in the midst of this story? Well, it is a place, it is a mini Eden. It's a mini garden. It is a place where Israel can meet with God, find order in the midst of their chaos, and enjoy a Sabbath rest. It's where they meet God. Now, at the end of the commands to build the tabernacle, you've got chapters 33 through 32 through 34, and you got the golden calf episode. Okay, now this, you got to think, oh my gosh, I cannot believe they did this. They've been waiting 400 years for this deliverance. At the end of Genesis, Joseph in Genesis chapter 50 says, hey, when God delivers you, take my bones, because He's going to take you to a good land and I want to be a part of that. And they all say, okay, yep, great. They wait 400 years for God to deliver them. He delivers them supernaturally, sovereignly, drowning the Egyptians in the Red Sea, doing a second creation event for them. 40 days later, they're worshiping golden calves. They're acting just like Adam and Eve. God wanted to bless them. They ended up acting just like Adam and Eve. So, we know the story. Moses goes and he intercedes for them. And you ask the question, all right, well, how's the story going to end? Does God really forgive them? Can the story move forward? Is God going to accept them? Did He make atonement for them? Well, chapter 35. Moses has made his intercession. Now in chapter 35 through 40, we're going to get the building of the tabernacle. And in chapter 35, verses 1 to 3, what's the first thing God says? What's the command? Keep the Sabbath. So the golden calf episode is bookended, it's bracketed by commands to keep the Sabbath. Because that's what it's supposed to be. It is a place where they can find Sabbath rest. So did Moses' intercession work? Are they still God's people? Has he forgiven them? Can the story move forward? Yep, because the first thing out of God's mouth is the last thing that was out of God's mouth before this horrific imitation of Adam and Eve that says, you know what, keep the Sabbath. Because that's actually what I have for you. Why is this so important? Well, if you think about the 7 days of creation. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What is different? What is unique about the 7th day of creation? Pardon? God rested. There's an expression there that's not found in the 7th day that ends the first 6 days. There was evening, there was morning, the first day. There was evening, morning, the second day. 7th day didn't end at creation. Which tells us what? What is life on this beautiful, ordered creation supposed to be? It's supposed to be a Sabbath, where we enjoy our fellowship with God, where we're provided for. We have a beautiful, perfect, inhabitable creation at the end of 6 days. We are God's crowning creation, and we are there to steward it and rule the planet for Him in this fellowship, and that's the way life on earth was supposed to be. How does Genesis 1 start? In the beginning. Now, we normally think, well, in the beginning, how do we interpret that? That's a way of saying that in the time before time, God did something. Well, okay, that is true. But in the beginning actually is another way of saying once upon a time. In other words, in Genesis 1, God began to tell you a story. In the beginning, let me tell you a story. In the beginning, which implies what? If there's a beginning, there is an end. What's the story supposed to be about? About God and His kingdom and how He blesses creation on this, and how He blesses His people on this beautiful creation. That's the story. That's what it's supposed to be. Well, we blow it. We commit rebellion. We're exiled from the garden. Now, we're going to see the story about how God is breaking into human history to establish His kingdom. My Bible is 1,889 pages long. We rebel on page 9. So God's going to take 1,880 pages to unfold this story. All right, with all of them, the Exodus and the conquest, in summary, it's about redemption. It's about covenant. God makes a covenant with His people that I'm going to redeem you. You're going to be my people. I've got a way for you to live. But the point is, you will be my people, I will be your God, and I'm going to reestablish what was lost in the garden. I'm going to break into human history, I'm going to establish my kingdom, and you're going to be my people. Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. Well, is Israel supposed to get a king? Does this kingdom really have a king? In Numbers chapter 24, it's the story of, it's the conclusion to the Balaam and Balak story. And I love that. Balaam, he gives the 3 prophecies where he only blesses Israel. And he says, and the king wants to say, oh, Balak says, all right, fine. You're not going to curse and get out of here. And Balaam says, well, actually, I got a freebie oracle for you. I'll give you one more just for free. And in chapter 7, in verse 17, he says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall arise out of Israel. And it will crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. And it goes on and on about how, what? A star and a scepter is who? Or is what? It's a king. Except this time, we're kind of getting some progressive revelation on the king. This time, the king is going to rule the nations of the world. In Genesis chapter 17, well, here's what you need to know about the king, Abraham. He's going to come from your descendants. That's all I'm going to tell you for now. He uses a pagan diviner to say, well, actually, this king that comes out of Judah is going to crush all the enemies of all the nations. He's going to rule the world. Wow. All right, so is this story going to have a good ending? How is this story going to play out? God really wants to bless. He really wants to establish His kingdom and restore and bless. Well, Deuteronomy 30, we'll do this and we'll take a break. Deuteronomy 31 and 32 kind of function as the prequel to Israel's story. And they got like a sequel and a prequel. You do The Hobbit after you do the first 3 movies so that you know what kind of happened at the beginning. All right, Deuteronomy 31 and 32. If you want to know how the story is going to turn out, you can read Deuteronomy 31 and 32. Could I have someone read Deuteronomy 31? It's kind of a long passage, but verses 24 through, well, the end of the chapter. Would somebody read that?
Moses had finished writing the words of the law in the book of the very end. Moses commanded the Levites to carry the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Take the book of the law and put it by the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there as a witness against you. For I know how rebellious and stubborn you are. Behold, even today, while I am yet alive with you, you have rebelled against the Lord. How much more after my death? Assemble me all the elders of your tribes and your officers, that I may speak these words in your ears and call heaven and earth to witness against them. For I know that after my death you will surely act corruptly and turn aside from the way that I have commanded you. In the days to come, evil will befall you because you will do this in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger through the work of your hands.
All right. Thank you. Notice what Moses says. You guys don't have a chance. I know what you're like now. You're already rebellious. You are not going to live this life of obedience. I know how the story's going to turn out. And so I'm going to have you write a song. And this song is going to be at the top of the charts for the next 1,000 years. And you're going to sing it, and you're going to learn it, and you're going to record it, because this is a witness against you. Here's how your history is going to play out. And so it starts off about, in chapter 32, you get this song, and it's about, how they're going to reject their rock, and how God was a father, but yet they rejected Him, and they committed idolatry, and God had to punish them, and how they're going to go into exile. But just like the prophets, what's the structure of the prophets? Deuteronomy 32 is the original prophecy, sin, judgment, restoration. The restoration passage begins in verse 34, where God says, I got to restore you. I'm going to vindicate my people in verse 36. And on and on and on about how He's going to vindicate His people. He is going to bring them back. But look at verse 43. Praise His people, O you nations, for He avenges the blood of His servants and takes vengeance on His adversaries and makes expiation for the land of His people. Now the interesting thing about that is, the way this is actually written, the command is to rejoice. What it actually says is, rejoice, O nations, His people. So way back here in Deuteronomy 31, God says, here's how your story is going to play out. You're going to rebel. I'm going to judge you. But I'm going to restore you. And that restoration includes Gentiles. You go, wow. Gentile inclusion at the end of Deuteronomy. We haven't even done this yet. And He's saying, yeah, it's going to include Gentiles. This is the passage that Paul is going to use in Romans chapter 15. This is one of the passages that Paul goes back to in order to argue for Gentile inclusion. He says, wait a minute, way back, Moses told you how the story would play out. You would rebel, and God would restore you. And when He restores you, it's going to include Gentiles. Okay, so let's look at the promises at this point. You've got a promise of a seed of the woman. You've got a promise to Abraham that he's going to have seed and land and blessing. And before you ever even get to a promise about David and his forever throne, you've got a promise that they're going to return, and it's going to include Gentiles. Now, wow, God's plan was always bigger than just Israel. Any thoughts or questions at this point? We actually have a lot to cover, but it's been 45 minutes, and I'm seeing some droopy eyes. Okay. What's he doing? He's breaking into human history to establish his kingdom in order to bring Sabbath rest and blessing and everything that he promises. Okay, with that, let's take a short 5-minute break.